We gathered here today to talk about Dr. Lawarence Nixon. He was a physician who practiced here in El Paso, but he actually began his life in Marshall, Texas. And so today, Barbara and I wanted to come together and discuss his beginnings, his movement to El Paso, and how he became a figure for civil rights, not only in El Paso and the state of Texas, but the United States as a whole. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Barbara and let her get us started.
Well, thank you all so much for having me. Again, my name is Barbara Judkins. I manage this beautiful site called Starr Home State Historic Site. We're a 3-acre site with 6 historic buildings, the most significant being this beautiful house you see before you. It's called Maple Crop. When Frank Starr built it, he planted some maple trees out front, and so Maple Crop means where the maples are. Frank and Clara Starr lived in this house. The family lived in this house for well over 100 years, and it was donated by Frank and Clara Starr's granddaughter, Clara Wilby, as a state historic site. So we're really honored to be joining you all there in El Paso. I've been to El Paso. I think it is a fabulous place, and I can't wait to go back. But we do live in an extremely large state, so I thought I would show you where Harrison County, Texas is. As you can see, we are right up against the state line. So if you look at the map of the county, you see there on the far right, you'll see Louisiana. So we are about 18 miles from Louisiana. Cattle Lake up at the top is about 15 miles from here. And Longview is halfway in the county if you look way over to the far left, which is Gray County. So we're way in East Texas. If you look at the bottom of this, the longest straight line distance in Texas is 108 miles from the northwest corner of the Panhandle to Brownsville, Texas. But if you drive from Magoffin to Starr, which has been done before by the Magoffin staff, Machelle mainly, it's 785 miles. It's only about 16 miles shorter than the longest drive in Texas. So it's a pretty long drive. I've never driven it, but I just wanted to give you all some perspective. Harrison County was established in 1839, but not organized until 1842. It was kind of the wild west out here in East Texas during those days. It was called, along the border here, was called the No Man's Land, and there was a lot of crime and nefarious deeds going on. The county is named after Jonas Harrison, who was a lawyer, a rather grumpy lawyer, and a Texas revolutionary. So I wanted to kind of introduce you to one of our heroes here at the site. His name is Fred Lewis. He also was involved in a civil rights lawsuit, case that went to the Supreme Court that re-enfranchised African Americans in Harrison County. Fred actually worked for the site off and on, but his main focus was education. He was an educator, and he also was involved in Wiley College, which is the college that Lawarence Nixon attended. And I do want to disclose that my daughter attended Wiley College and graduated from Wiley last May. So Wiley College is part of our family and in our heart, and we just think that's wonderful. So, and Fred, we erected a historical marker to honor Fred and his actions on behalf of the voters at Harrison County, which is here at the site. The site currently has 2 historical markers. So, what I wanted to share with you was just a little bit about Lawarence Nixon's origins. I call this From Lucy to Lawarence. Lucy was his grandmother, his maternal grandmother. Her name was Lucy Orton Eagledow Patterson. This is my research and the way I organize it. It probably doesn't look like some college professor's research, but this is the way I keep things straight in my brain. And so there are lots of there's lots of great information here that we found about Lucy Patterson. Her original name was Orton. We think that she had been enslaved by the Orton family in Nacogdoches, Texas. That's the first time she appears on the census, of course, is 1870, 5 years after the slaves were monumented. And she's living in the home of E.J. 5, which is Clara Starr's brother. So the Starr home that I just showed you is that woman's brother, and she's working as a domestic in his household with a man who is her husband, but it doesn't say he's her husband on that particular census, but he is. They did get married in 1867, and their 2 daughters, Valerie and Annie. We have found a lot of information about Valerie, who is Lawarence Nixon's mother, but her sister Annie, it's hard to research. One of the issues is that Annie died in 1887. We think she's buried here locally. I haven't been able to find that grave. But also the man she married, his name was Alonzo McFarland. And the unfortunate thing is that the McFarland name gets spelled a whole bunch of different ways in legal papers, from McFarland to McFarlane, and all sorts of different ways. So you have to really be diligent to make sure that you've got the right person. And Annie, like I said, has been a little more difficult to research than Valerie. But Valerie Nixon is Lawarence Nixon's mother. His father's name is Charles Nixon. He is buried here at a cemetery about 3 miles from the site named Powder Mill Cemetery. But I wanted to show you all my research. His mother, Lucy, like I said, Orton was probably her original last name through to the people who had enslaved her. Eagledow was her husband, her first husband's last name. His name was Alvin Johnson Eagledow. The Starrs were friends with both the Orton families and the Eagledows when they lived in Nacogdoches, where they lived before they moved to Marshall in 1870. The last living Orton in Nacogdoches, he and I have connected, and we plan to do some deeper research so that we can definitively say whether Lucy had been in the household of his ancestors. We haven't made that connection, but we do have one letter that names an enslaved person at the right age, at the right time in Nacogdoches, Lucy, and there's and in the Orton family. So we have a very tenuous evidence. We don't want to say that confirms it, but it looks like that may be the confirming little piece of evidence that we need. Patterson is her married name by her second husband, whose name was Booker Patterson. It does not look like they had children together, that the only 2 children she had were Valerie and Annie. As you can see, she died on, it looks like January the 1st, 1917. She did, and these are her descendants, so there's quite a few descendants from Lucy Patterson. There is a baby, if you look on this slide way down at the end, it says Mary Patterson. There's an infant Mary Patterson that shows up on the 1880 census when Lucy and her husband Booker were living here in Marshall, but it shows up nowhere else. So we don't know if that baby died in infancy, if it somehow she just managed to drop off the census rolls, or we don't know. So we can only speculate, and it's kind of hard to speculate on something you don't know what happened. So, so the reference here, if you see on the right side of this slide, a lot of the information outside of the census records and newspapers.com and things like that. Most of my information came from the wonderful Will Guzman, who wrote the book Border Physician, The Life of Lawarence A. Nixon. There's another book, Dr. Lawarence A. Nixon and the White Primary by Corey Bryson, and then Will Guzman's Civil Rights in Texas, in the Texas borderland. So those have all been great references to talk about Lawarence Nixon's life. He did grow up in Marshall and graduated from Wiley College. And so, like I said, my daughter went there, so that's my daughter's alma mater as well. This document, and if I'm going too fast, let me know. I'm super excited to be with you all. So, this document on the left here is Lucy Patterson's will. And you can see it doesn't look like a lot of money, but this is 1917 money. So if you look up, there's some money there. There's some funds, but she did have a savings. She did have some personal property. She and her husband there's a family memoir that said they were a musical family and that there were all sorts of musical instruments in their house, which I think is really cool. That does add some a personality to them and kind of makes them come alive. The photograph here on the right is, we don't have a lot of photographs of the family, and the ones that are certainly not in our collection, nor have I found any in Marshall, but they do come from Will Guzman's book. But this one right here came from a book documenting the history of Marshall, and it's a class of young men and young women. And if you see down in the bottom left, the front row, the second young man standing up on his knees kind of has his brow furrowed with a nice tie there. That is Blanton. That is Lucy Cardoxon's grandson, Blanton. His last name is just gone out of my brain, but it is nice to have a good, solid photograph of the family to show you all. Now, on this slide are more photographs of the family, and I'm sorry they're blurry, but I did snag that out of Will Guzman's book. But the main photograph is the photograph on the top right next to Lawarence Nixon's photograph, which is clear. That's his mother. That is Valerie Ingalldowne Nixon. And if you look, you can see the same kind of facial features, almost that same resting face that they both have. The chin, the mouth, the nose. So to me, it's clearly that's mother and son. It is mother and son. And then these are other relatives. The top left photograph is Charles Nixon, so that is Lawarence Nixon's father. The one in the middle, I believe, is Lawarence Nixon's brother. And then the other two ladies are his sisters. And then there's the bottom right photograph, blurry, that's the oval, is another photograph of Lawarence Nixon. I think these are great photographs. I would love to see the originals, but like I said, my source was Will Guzman's book. But I did want to put some faces to some of the names. And that's all I have. I want to thank you all for listening, and if you have any questions about the research I've done, it's ongoing. But hopefully that gave you a little bit of background of the family dynamic, and I'm going to hand it over to Machelle.
All right. Let me open up mine. And I'm going to take us, oh, I'm sorry, she can't hear me. How rude. So I'm going to take us from where Barbara has left us and bring you to just a little bit, just kind of quick catch up, because there's a lot to cover after he begins his life here in El Paso. He did, of course, receive his medical degree at Meharry. He did end up practicing in Cameron, and he did have some experiences in Cameron which led him to El Paso. Now, there is mention in Will Guzman's book that Dr. Nixon actually had visited with his mother El Paso in 1893. I have exhausted many different ways of looking for that and have not found anything. The story is that he was visiting an uncle, and that Will Guzman posits that potentially there was something about El Paso at that time which was very appealing to him after having had experiences of violence towards African Americans in Cameron, having witnessed that, having experienced some of that. And I will tell you just from some basic research, El Paso at that time was actually fairly welcoming to African American population post-Civil War, and that there wasn't the same sort of level of violence. I'm not saying it was without violence, but definitely the same level of violence experienced by those who were formerly enslaved and those who were existing post-Civil War. So Dr. Nixon arrives here in January of 1910, and he, again, is coming here after having visited, and things have changed. Let me paint a picture really quickly of El Paso pre-1910. Pre-1910, El Paso, I did, during some of my research looking for his uncle, I did notice that the El Paso City Directory did in 1893 break out in little brackets those people who were African American. They were listed as colored, abbreviated in parentheses in the book. But the next directory in 1895 had entirely removed that. So there was no distinction within the next city directory. I found that kind of interesting. And so after having experienced that in his visit here, the city was starting to experience the beginnings of Jim Crow laws. So he ends up joining, as soon as he arrives almost, within just a few short years, the local branch, the El Paso branch of the NAACP. It's formed in May of 1914. Jasper Williams served as the president. His friend Leroy White, who came from Cameron, Texas with him, serves as the secretary. William Coleman was treasurer, and Dr. Nixon is actually the chairman of the executive board. And it was, what I found really interesting was El Paso was the first, if not one of the first, cities in Texas to actually have an NAACP branch. There's some conjecture between us and Houston as to who was formed earlier. January 19th of 1921 was a very forming situation for Dr. Nixon and his movement towards civil rights. At that date, there was an arrest of a man named Henry Lowry. Now, Henry Lowry had actually been a sharecropper in Modena, Arkansas for Obson Craig, and Craig was known to be violent towards African Americans, and he did not settle his accounts with black sharecroppers. Of course, sharecroppers being the practice of leasing part of your land and everything needed to grow crops on that land. But Mr. Craig actually went further than that. He provided clothing and the food that the family would actually consume and everything they needed. He had like a company store there that was open to the sharecroppers on his land, leasing his land. And the idea was every year you did a settlement of your accounts, and typically sharecroppers were given anywhere from 50 to 30% of the overall take after selling the crops they produced for that farm. But Mr. Craig was known for not ever settling accounts. Well, Mr. Lowry became tired of that, and he went to Mr. Craig's home demanding an accounting of, a settlement of his accounts. And Mr. Craig basically assaulted him, and Mr. Lowry left. Well, Mr. Lowry returns on Christmas Day of 1920, and again, they fought. Only this time, Mr. Lowry was armed. And so, Mr. Craig threw a stick at Mr. Lowry. Mr. Lowry goes to leave, but then Mr. Craig's son, Richard, actually shoots him and injures him. And so Mr. Lowry returned fire and left. Well, in that, he ended up killing Mr. Craig and a daughter-in-law, and ended up injuring two of the sons. So Mr. Lawarence escapes to El Paso, looking to cross into Mexico. Only problem is Mr. Lawarence doesn't have any money to go across and start a new life. So he takes a few odd jobs, but he ends up sending a letter back to his family there in Modena, Arkansas. Only problem is the Postmaster General and the Clerk of Court is Richard Craig, the gentleman who shot him. And Richard Craig, ends up intercepting the letter and finding out that he's in El Paso, ends up contacting the police here in El Paso to have him arrested, which they do. It's at this point that Dr. Nixon, along with members of the local branch of the NAACP, visit Mr. Lowry in his cell. And they fight to get the governor of Arkansas, Thomas C. McCrae, to guarantee Mr. Lowry's safety for returning to Arkansas for a trial. And within just less than 48 hours, they get that guarantee from the governor. The only problem is the governor didn't pass that along to lawmen in the state adjacent, Mississippi. And lawmen from Mississippi ended up intercepting him on the train and taking him 166 miles further east into Sardis, Mississippi, where unfortunately his wife and child were first to watch his brutal lynching. Now, Dr. Nixon read about this in the El Paso Herald, and the writer of that article actually opined that it was a shame that Mr. Lowry's end was so quick. Goodness. Excellent. There we go. So I do want to kind of break down, I do want to kind of break down actually I'm breaking down Dr. Nixon's life into 3 different subjects. One is how he changed medical services for the Black community here in El Paso. Another is his movement to create quality of life measures that would have been available to African Americans here in El Paso. And finally, the overarching civil rights cases in which he was involved. So just as a basic understanding, prior to Dr. Nixon's arrival, there was actually a white physician, Dr. D. Hunter Huffaker, who typically did serve, at least in an emergency capacity, the African Americans in El Paso. And I've actually included a couple articles describing Dr. Huffaker's care. But there were many, many articles that describe what he did for the Black community. And I found this kind of interesting because when Dr. Nixon arrives, that changes. Typically, you did not have white physicians serving the African American community. It was entirely separate but equal, right? We've all heard that. So when Dr. Nixon arrives here, he's looking to potentially start a hospital to service the Black community. None of the hospitals here would allow him actually any rights to serve his patients. He was not allowed privileges in a lot of the hospitals here. And so it was actually white physicians who were allowed to practice in these medical facilities who would kind of admit his patients, look the other way, and allow Dr. Nixon to come in and treat them. In the mid-1920s, Dr. Nixon actually seeks to create a tubercular hospital here for the African American community. El Paso, the desert Southwest, was actually very famous for the dry climate and how therapeutic that was for tubercular patients. And so there were no hospitals to serve the African American community. And so he tried to get support from the NAACP and different medical associations, and they would not support him in this. Mostly because he had no local support for El Paso. He tried to move it to Socorro, New Mexico, and seek support there. But everyone felt like it was too far out of the way. Particularly if if you think about treating patients who originate from Chicago or, Seattle, Washington. These are far distances to travel, and this is a community that typically didn't have a lot of discretionary funds and may not have been able to not only pay for all this time in a hospital, but be able to pay to return to see their families. The expectation was that they would unfortunately pass away in these places. And so you didn't want to be in the middle of nowhere. The concept of being in the middle of nowhere was off-putting. Imagine that. So what was interesting though was his wife, his second wife actually, Drusilla Nixon, she describes his clientele. And it seems that they were predominantly Hispanic. He did have, obviously, a large number of African-American patients, but he also had a few white people and a few Filipino residents that were patients as well. So she ended up calling it the United Nations in his office. And so, one interesting note, I did mention this was his second wife, Drusilla. Dr. Nixon did actually have a first wife, Esther J. Calvin Nixon, but she passes in 1920 during the influenza pandemic, and she was only 36 years old. Keep in mind, this is the wife of a middle-class physician who is expiring, and typically at that time, influenza typically hit the lower classes hard. And here you had someone who was in the medical field and middle class and still lost his wife. And he didn't actually remarry for quite some time, like 16 years, before he remarries.
What was the building, Machelle?
So that is Hotel Dieu. That is the one hospital that, by the way, I did want to mention this connection. Hotel Dieu, the funding for the building of this was by Octavia Magoffin, Joseph's wife.
That is the original Hotel Dieu?
Yes, ma'am.
Shocking, huh?
Located
like
in the same place as the one that we knew?
No, it is not. This was actually downtown, like what we consider now in the downtown area.
So this has been raised?
Yes.
Do we know it's on the site?
I'm sorry?
Do we know it's on the site now?
I don't know what.
That's the original that the nuns from St. Louis had built and whatnot.
Yes, yes. And like I said, Octavia did the fundraising for that. So there you go.
Wow.
So that is one connection we have. So I want to move on to Dr. Nixon's attempts to improve the quality of life for Black El Pasoans. The public swimming pool at Washington Park was only open to white people. And when I say white people, it can get confusing because at this time there seemed to be a sliding scale as to when it benefited certain people as to whether our Mexican American community was considered white or not. Okay, in this case, I do believe they were considered not. Okay, but Dr. Nixon he pushed with the city to get a segregated pool for the Black community. And the city approves it. Only problem is they have a disagreement over where it should be located. Dr. Nixon wants it in Washington Park right next to the other pool. The city disagrees. They want to put it over by Douglas School, Douglas Elementary. And Dr. Nixon, at that point, he was like, that is actually quite a far ways to travel. At this point, Washington Park really was kind of the center of town. and a little easier to get to. Plus, it had a streetcar access. Streetcars ran through what we now call Manhattan Heights and Austin Heights and all of that, Austin Terrace, sorry. All of that area, they ran extensively through there. So there was public transportation that was easily accessible. There were ways to get there. But over by Douglas Elementary, it was a little harder to get to. Unfortunately, it got stuck in committee, if you will, and never came to fruition.
By the way, Mel Richardson, the book that was written about him, he's co-authored. I was dismayed to learn that into the late 50s, only one pool, only one public swimming pool in El Paso was open to everyone. It was open one day a year,
Yes.
the day before it was drained.
Yes.
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 Yes. My goodness. And some of the discrimination that Nolan Richardson was befriended by Bert Williams, who became councilman that later became mayor. That prompted Bert Williams to promote a city ordinance barring discrimination based on race. And that was actually passed in El Paso in 1963, the year before the Civil Rights Act.
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. So now I do want to get into the civil rights cases, Supreme Court cases that Dr. Nixon was involved in. I'll be honest with you, I really had to study these and get the distinction and what, made me so different. I kept wondering, gosh, these are two cases spread out. What was the difference? Not a lot, except how the Supreme Court ruled and kind of maybe the central issue of what was at hand. In 1927, having paid a poll tax, which was a state legislative act in 1905 to try and get people to pay to vote. It obviously was one more way to limit someone's ability to vote, because you had to have the money to pay said poll tax to be able to vote. Dr. Nixon had been doing that since the beginning of the poll tax. He had been paying it for years and years and years. Now, at this time, I should mention, the NAACP was actually quietly going around and looking for professional African-American men to go in and vote during primaries. They had a few different qualifications for this. One was that they had to be professional. They had to not receive a lot of their income, the vast majority of their income, from the white community. They had to be willing to, and having paid their poll tax and be willing to do this.
Is the distinction that they not rely on the white community for their money to protect the participants so that they can continue with their lives during these processes?
Yeah, because here's the problem. If you did this thing and you were not allowed to do it, and a big stink gets raised and you are now potentially suing the government for this right, if your money is made from a white community who may agree that you shouldn't be voting in the primary, you're going to lose your income. They did not want anyone to suffer losing their income. They wanted someone whose income would be safe and resistant to everything that would go around with it. So Dr. Nixon, he did attempt to vote in the Democratic primary on July 26, 1924. He went into the poll, he asked for a ballot, and he was denied. Actually by the election officer at that time, whose last name was Herndon. And with the assistance of the NAACP, Dr. Nixon presented his case to bring an injunction against the statute in the United States District Court for the Western District of Texas. The court dismissed the case. So the appeal automatically went straight to the Supreme Court of the United States, where they reversed the lower court's decision to dismiss it and ruled that while the matter concerned a political action, it did involve personal damages and was valid. I'll explain this. In his case, Dr. Nixon was seeking $5,000 of damages.
Can I pass this around? You've ever seen a poll tax? That's my father's.
Really? That's
I still have it.
So they stated that because it seems to us so hard to imagine a more direct and obvious infringement of the 14th Amendment, they didn't even address the 14th Amendment. They felt like it was so obvious, they didn't need to mention that really just the fact that this was done was bad enough, okay? And so that law, when it comes back to the Texas legislature that the Supreme Court has ruled this, gets taken off the books. It gets taken out. But what they did instead was the state produced another law that said that the parties, the political parties themselves, can determine the qualifications for voters for their primaries. That they were in charge of their primaries, not the state, the political parties were, and they could determine who was qualified to vote or not. So in July of 1928, when Dr. Nixon goes to pick up his ballot, he again gets denied. So at this point, the election official then, Condon, he was actually an attorney with the state, a very well-known and successful attorney.
By the way, the importance of that, Texas was a very solidly Democratic state at the time.
Well, yes, I didn't explain the political.
And if you didn't vote in the Democratic primary, you weren't voting because the Democratic nominee.
Well, it gets even worse than that. In my opinion, you're right. I didn't discuss the political landscape. The parties were very different.
Yeah.
The platforms had changed, okay? And the Democratic Party at this point was mostly tied to the Jim Crow laws that were being produced. And they had the vast majority of control in the state of Texas and in quite a few areas within the country. And yes, the Republicans were considered the weaker party, and yes, if you wanted something done, you did want to vote within the Democratic Party to actually feel like you had a say. Yes. And that was one of the requirements by the NAACP, was they also had to vote in the Democratic primary, not the Republican primary, but the Democratic primary. So at any rate, the Democratic Party, at this point, like the legislation, they pull the rules away, say the parties are in charge. The Democratic Party then adopts the rule that they only allow white voters to vote in the primary. Same thing, just by different action, right? So once again, Dr. Nixon sought action from the Western District Court and was dismissed. The appeal went to the 5th District Court of Appeals and then to the Supreme Court. The court ruled that the state had handed their election duties to the parties, and while they may describe themselves as a private entity, they were assuming a government function and bounded by the same laws. That anything that had to do with voting was a right guaranteed by the government, and you were agreeing to guaranteeing that right on behalf of the government. That a private entity, you wouldn't be allowed to claim that. So they end up getting rid of the all-white primary, right? Yeah. Dr. Nixon wouldn't be able to vote in a Democratic primary until 1944. And that's after the case of Smith versus Albright, which did away entirely with all-white primaries. So on July 22nd, he and his wife, Drusilla, actually were able to vote. Now, I do want to provide you with some further reading that was available. Earlier, Barbara had mentioned the Will Guzman doctoral thesis. I've got that in there, and I will make this available to anyone who would like. I actually did have a really good description of those court cases by the El Paso Bar Journal that gave a great breakdown of those, made those very understandable. but there's kind of a broad overview of everything that kind of went into today. Now, this is something we're still continuing. Barbara is trying to find more of a connection. I'm trying to find the uncle that Dr. Nixon was visiting. I am very curious about that.
And I have a couple of things to say that I forgot to say.
Oh.
Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I have a couple of other things. There's something I remembered, so when you get done, I'll chime in.
Go ahead.
Well, what I forgot to do is make the connection of Lawarence Nixon to the Starr family, which is kind of the main reason you invited me to this shindig anyway. And that is that Lawarence Nixon's grandmother, Lucy Patterson, who I told you about before, is on the 1880 census as the cook for Frank and Clara Starr here at Starr Family Home. She's also on the same census in 1880 in her own home with her husband and their grandson Blanton, the photograph of the young child I showed you earlier. So we do feel a connection to Lawarence Nixon through his grandmother Lucy. That's outside of being at Clara Starr's brother's house in Nacogdoches in 1870 and at the Starr Family Home in 1880. We don't really know anything outside of that. We do have one letter that alludes to her daughter being air quote nurse here in the house because through their marriage, Frank and Clara did have 10 children, so they did need some help with all those bibbies. But we don't know to that extent. So like Machelle, the research is ongoing, and it is like finding a diamond at that diamond crater place in Arkansas, right? You got to do a lot of digging before you find one little nugget. So we are working on that as well.
Absolutely. So yeah, I guess open for any questions if you have any.
I guess he was a general practitioner.
Yeah, he was considered a surgeon at the time. There really wasn't a general practitioner, or there wasn't, outside of a very developed hospital setting. And when I mean developed, I don't mean like Hotel Duke. Like New York City level hospitals had more specialists per se, but there really wasn't much distinction yet.
So back in the day, I guess they treated them in their home, or did they have like
Correct.
a large home that they
Both.
used as a hospital?
Both. Yeah.
In the back of this room, we've got a picture of the office for this doctor. So he was a white doctor, August Justice. And he had a room downtown, but he also would like go to where things were happening.
Correct.
So when people got shot in the brothels, Dr. Justice went to the brothel and took care of them there.
Well, I remember the day where house calls were a thing.
Right,
Yeah,
and that would happen, just depending. And keep in mind that a lot of the newspaper stuff that I was researching for doctors and the care of the African American community, obviously there's not going to be a ton of articles about just regular old doctor visits, right? Mm-hmm. It's going to be about emergency situations, things that made the news. So, yeah.
Did El Paso have a census during the 1890s, something like that, where they listed people's names?
Oh yeah, of course. In fact, we know from the census in 1880 there was only 736 people in the entire county.
And they put them by name?
Yeah.
By name?
Yeah. It was the people in your household. So your children's names, their ages, genders were typically included in this. For adults, you often saw professions listed as well.
Where they were born.
Yeah.
If they could read or write.
Yeah.
Unfortunately for us, the 1890 census was caught in a fire, and most of the records were destroyed, including like all the Texas records, as far as I'm aware. Mm-hmm. So most of our historic sites have a big black hole of we would love to know about that census.
Yeah. A sidebar. Do you have any idea how much the poll tax was? I didn't see it on the image. So just.
Well, there was two images. I enlarged it for everyone here.
Do you have
saw
any idea, Barbara, how expensive the poll taxes were?
I think it was 20.
No, I do not. I need to do some more work on that myself.
See, it doesn't. Do you see anything that? I mean, it's a receipt, but not for amount.
Right.
But simply payment. Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Go ahead, Barbara.
A lot of it wasn't necessarily about the money, it was about the intimidation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, those were a twofer right there, they were twins. And a member of the Starr family, Frank Starr's brother, was also involved in the White Citizens Party here in Machelle that helped create a lot of that poll tax the rules and things like that. And he was pretty high up in the party at the time.
Right.
Is your dad still alive?
No, he passed in '68 as a matter of fact. I was 3.
So we wouldn't, we don't have a reference.
Sure.
Earlier you made reference to a city directory or something like that.
Correct.
That's different than the census records?
No, it's very different. It's almost like a phone book, but without phone numbers. So it typically gave the name of the person an idea of where their residence and where their work was, and it would tell their profession. So, like, I was looking at George Patterson. He was a porter for Wells Fargo, and it would tell, South San Antonio Street. It would even give necessarily a finite address, just generally South San Antonio Street. Yeah.
Where can you access the record?
I accessed this, let me say that one more time. I accessed it
750.
off the portal to Texas History.
Right there, right above the
Have you ever
signature.
been on that? So it's a website, just Google Portal to Texas History. It's through the University of North Texas, right, Barbara?
In 66.
Yep.
Yeah.
So it's
And
not that much
they're
back in
incredible
66.
archives.
Let's see.
I was just wondering if it was prohibitive.
Newspapers,
What was the minimum wage in
photographs,
'66?
Any
was what?
archive.
What was the minimum wage?
that
65
is
cents?
feeding into them, it shares it all. So you can put in your search,
Like a day and a
you
half
know,
of
So-
words
wages?
and stuff. And
So
it'll
is that
pull
good
up
for,
newspapers, books,
like,
documents, photographs,
For
all
4
sorts of
years?
stuff. But it also has
$1.25
bunch of
was
city
it?
directories for us on
So it
there.
was half a day's wages.
Second question,
A little over half a day's wages.
after the second court ruling,
Mhm.
the Supreme Court ruling, in favor of Dr. Nixon,
Mhm.
then more than a decade passed before we accepted the vote.
Yes.
What happened in there that continued to suppress the vote?
So, it's complex, but it would seem that the governor at the time, his name is escaping me, basically, with the help of the Attorney General and Texas Rangers, was able to, in many ways, just kind of keep moving the ball, right? Keep changing the law just enough with the same idea in its end. Because realize none of those judgments up to that point said you can't have an all-white primary. It's just saying you can't do that as a state government, but it's not really defining. Like, they were kind of obtuse in their rulings. This was really during the heyday of judicial review, of interpretation of the law. That kind of has changed with time, and this is the beginnings of why it changes, is because each time you said, no, you can't do that, and yeah, we're ruling, and we don't even feel the need to explain why you're violating the 14th Amendment. Okay, well, if you're not going to explain it, we're just going to keep doing it. So they did it again, just a different way. It couldn't be the government involved, so it's going to be a private party, right? The Democratic Party choosing that. Well, it's still the same idea, still an all-white primary, but it's not the government making that choice, it's the Democratic Party. But that's only because the governmental agency has given their power to the parties of determining qualifications for voters. So it just kept changing and changing until in 1944, in that Smith versus Albright case, the Supreme Court was like, we've had it. You can no longer do all-white primaries. It violates the 14th and 15th Amendments. Here's all the ways it violates it. No more. It's done.
Nixon himself never pursued another court action.
No, I think 2 was probably enough. I mean, it took years. I mean, realize he votes, that first denial of the ballot occurred in 1924, but that case doesn't really, and it had a short path to the Supreme Court even. It still doesn't get ruled on until 1927, like 3 years later. Then the second case, It happens in 1928, 4 years after the last election, right? And it doesn't get ruled on by the Supreme Court until 1932. Now, it did have one more appeals court process to go through than the last one, but still it took years. These cases take years. It's a huge investment of time and money and everything to make that happen.
Machelle?
Yeah.
The case that Juan Lewis was involved in didn't get resolved by the Supreme Court until 1951.
Yeah.
Yikes.
So that's 30 years would be later after you guys are.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think it's really amazing how most of the dates we're talking about feel very in the past, but Dr. Nixon didn't vote 80 years ago. That's so recent.
Yeah, exactly.
And UTEP wasn't desegregated until 1955, and that was
Right.
the first university in Texas.
And same year, 1955, Dr. Nixon actually gets to join the El Paso County Medical Association, which he was not allowed to join before then because of his race. And suddenly in 1955, that changed as well, and he joined. And mind you, this is at retirement. By 1955, Dr. Nixon's in his 70s, going into his 70s, okay? He dies in 1966 at the age of like 83 or so, but not for the reasons you might think. He actually dies in a car accident on I-10. Yeah, sadly. So, yeah, kind of interesting. I mean, he's an incredible man. He did a lot to try to change and allow more access to voting. He was very tenacious about protecting and opening up El Paso to all of its community.
So he was a practicing physician for about 45 years?
Longer than that. He had been practicing. When did he arrive in Cameron, Barbara? Do you remember?
Oh, I'd have to look. I'm not good with dates, you know.
I know. I know he comes to El Paso in 1910, and I want to say he had been practicing a few years in Cameron before that.
Yeah, probably, yeah.
So, I would say, yeah, I'll go 1905. So 1905 to 1966, that's...
Oh, he was still practicing?
61 years. Well, he retired. He had retired. But when you're a physician, you're kind of always a physician. He was a member of all the different boards and organizations and stuff, and he did actually serve on a lot of boards. So 61 years.
Are there still Nixons here in town?
That's a great question.
I know a tad about that.
They have
Because of Drusilla.
What was the question?
Whether Dr. Nixon's family, if he has any descendants living here in El Paso.
Share with us,
He
Ava.
probably does not because all of his children moved to Arizona.
Right, his.
But they may have moved back.
I'm not aware of any Nixons back in El Paso. I thought that some of the children had moved to Albuquerque. Maybe it's Phoenix or whatever, but they're not in town.
Yeah.
A question that comes to my mind is just about the Klan was organized for a long time across the state of Texas.
Mm-hmm.
The NAACP had national strategies and Texas strategies and Mississippi strategies, and you had to really be in it for the long haul. Some of what you said is about the long haul. I'd like to read this, The Making of a Lynching Culture. I think that's a really important source. And the Texas Rangers had their strategies. Everybody has all these control strategies. But there's a fire station where Nixon voted for the first time officially. And there's a marker in front of the fire station. I want to say it's up there on Rio Grande Street. And I think it'd be nice. I wish a member of the African American community in El Paso would write a history of the NAACP in El Paso. That would be such a useful thing. And there's
Speaking of Black El Paso history, I know that the Community Foundation and a number of others are working on one of our guided walking tours for the city, and they're putting it together, I think, in 3 parts, with major sort of downtown, and then the Paisano area, and further east. But I've seen the list, and I know for sure the fire station is on there, and it should be like the star of the show.
Yeah, right.
So
Hopefully they're getting them, because one thing I didn't mention about Dr. Nixon was he actually funded and started the Myrtle Avenue Methodist Church, which was just right up the street on Myrtle across Cotton, right next to his home and office. So
He lived on Myrtle?
yeah, he lived on Myrtle. And we have his address. It's like 29 something. But yeah, he lived on Myrtle. Just right around the corner from us, Barbara, here at the
But it
home.
happens not to be within the boundaries of the.
I know, the
Magoffin.
historic district. I know.
Wow.
thank you,
Well,
Michelle.
thank you,
Thank you,
Barbara.
Barbara.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
The building is still there, right? It's
Yes.
like a store or like a bodega or something?
I think yes, I believe the church is a bodega now, and the home, I want to say, has been repurposed and stuff, but it is still there. And it's, yeah, they're there. But they're outside of our historic district boundary. So the city determined a boundary for the historic district with, all of that. And so it's just right on the other side of the line.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Yes, it is. But thank you, Barbara.